Dr. Hans Utter, welcome back to the Gnostic Media Podcast for your third time. And we also did a radio interview on Friday on RBN together. And so this is actually your third time for the Gnostic Media Podcast, but welcome back.
Thanks, Jan. It's great to be here again.
All right. Well, I know the audience has been dying to hear part 2 of this, and we also decided to do at least a part 3. And so there's a whole lot more here. Today we're going to be going into lots of music. You're going to be playing and giving some examples and all kinds of good stuff. So, well, why don't I, in fact, let you give a little overview of what we're going to cover today?
Okay. Yeah, today, primarily we're going to look into, in a little more detail, the effects of music on the body, and actually music itself, how it works. I think it's very important for people to have an understanding of what music is, how sound goes together, how sound frequencies work. Then we're going to go into stuff on the history of tuning, and also look at, various types of music, and a little bit on the origins and things like that. So, but primarily I'm going to really look at how music has been used traditionally and how we look at the direct effect on the body and the mind that music has. And at the end, I'll go into the A440 controversy, and that will tie into the development of music as a form of mass control connection and connected with images, media, lights, this kind of thing, sound installation. And then finally, I was going to talk a little about the neuroscience of music. Probably we'll save that for the next time. That's kind of a pretty extensive subject, but yeah. So I just basically want to get people an understanding of music, what it is, how it works, and also showcase again some of the positive aspects of music.
All right. Well, let's get started. So, you want to start off with music in the body?
Yeah. So, in order to really understand how music works and how music affects the human being, the human organism, it's important to have an understanding of the body as not just a chunk of matter that's operated by a small processor in the head, but it's actually the entire body is filled with water, and also it functions on electricity and vibration, right? So the vibrations, different frequencies, the use of electricity for communication within cells. So actually the cellular level, our body is essentially vibrationally based and electrically based, right? So in fact, sound vibrations have an immense impact on the organism itself. And this ties into things, again, like light and other images and other types of things. But basically, the body itself is not really limited to what we perceive as just our physical body, but in fact, there is described an energy field basically that we inhabit, and that's, I mentioned, I think on the radio, a device to basically track biophysiological organisms through FM radio, right? So the electrical nature of our body is really what music operates on and works on, and obviously it goes much deeper than that, but that's just an important understanding to have. And hopefully later also get into consciousness itself and how consciousness has been seen both through certain psychologists. I think John Smythes in England, did a lot of mescaline research, but he has an interesting book called The Walls of Plato's Cave, which he uses string theory to define the localization of consciousness as actually occurring in a different dimension, so to speak, than the physical world. That may sound a little far out, but I have a very interesting interview with an Air Force intelligence officer describing that exact same principle in terms of using these kind of models to understand the mind. Because in fact, consciousness and the mind, while they are connected, they are also distinct. So it's important to see the entire body as operating as a system, a very complex system that's also connected with the environment. So that's kind of a basic. I will offer some more detail.
Yeah, and just to give the audience an update on John Smithies, he was CIA MKUltra Subproject 8, and he went to the University of Cambridge, St. George. He worked at St. George Hospital. He was also working with Dr. Abram Hoffer and Humphrey Osmond, and they helped to create the adrenochrome theory. And he also worked with Arthur Koester, and all of these guys I've exposed in previous articles, but I just wanted to give a quick update on his MKUltra background.
Yeah, and you really hope that these guys have not figured out a way to crack the code of consciousness. But that being said, as much as has gone into the control of society, it indicates that there is a degree of freedom that we do have. And especially, say, for example, through something like the trivium, quadrivium, and things like that, we have a lot of parts of us that can go beyond, being influenced negatively. And just to say, I think it's very important to look at these positive effects or possibilities of music, especially in the third part, because the material that I've gone into is pretty dire. It's and it's also, I feel, it's pretty well grounded empirically. But let me just give a few quotes on music, the effect of music in the body. And the first one is from Bach, and pretty well-known quote: "The aim and final end of all music should be none other than the glory of God and the refreshment of the soul." So, and I'll talk a little bit later about Plato. I mentioned ancient China before, but the fact was that music was seen as an extremely powerful influence, not only in the structuring of society, but even the development of the mind. So, and then Hazrat Inayat Khan, who's an Indian veena player, lived in the late 19th century, early 20th century. This is from his book, Mysticism of Sound. He says, quote, "A person does not hear sound only through the ears. He hears sound through every pore of his body. It permeates the entire being, and according to its particular influence, either slows or quickens the rhythm of the blood circulation. It either weakens or soothes the nervous system. It arouses a person to greater passions, or it calms him by bringing him peace. According to the sound and its influences, a certain effect is produced. Sound becomes visible in the form of radiance. This shows that the same energy which goes into the form of sound before being visible is absorbed by the physical body. In the same way, the physical body recuperates and becomes charged with a new magnetism." End quote. So that's Hazrat Inayat Khan again, and he was very much concerned also with the negative development of music. At this time, it was mostly jazz and pop music, but even he wasn't a big fan of sitar too much. He said it was too fast. But that shows, coming from, this is from the Sufi tradition. And we do find the use of music and trance all throughout the world. And in fact, the use of healing modalities in music is found in Native American cultures. It's found in Indonesia. It's found, pretty much everywhere you want to look at that. And another couple quotes from Plato: "Rhythm and harmony find their place into the inward places of the soul." And that shows that music does permeate the mind-body, right? Whether or not you want to posit a soul, but you can certainly posit a consciousness, right? And so scientifically, more and more, this is being proven through thousands of studies, actually, that show that the body and the brain, especially, are transformed or can be transformed through music. And another quote from Plato: "Musical training is a potent instrument is a more potent instrument than any other in the integration of the human being, because harmony and rhythm find their way into the inward places of the soul, on which they mightily fasten, imparting grace and making the soul of him who is rightly educated truly graceful. And then we'll go a little bit. Plato also, I have something from the Republic where he's describing different types of music and stating which one will work for the society and which one will have negative impacts. So again, this has been around for thousands of years, and actually, the Plato and Aristotle had a very good understanding of this quite some time ago. And one thing that both Plato and Aristotle called attention to was the fact that music especially impacts the youth. So you're much more susceptible to music as a youth, and that the music itself, especially the rhythm, the use of harmony, and the tuning, will offend or create, offend the sensibilities, meaning that it can create individuals who are becoming entrained or are allowing, you could say, lower passions, which is, in our today's world, it's kind of hard to say that it feels good, do it, right? That's kind of the mantra of rock music. If it feels good, be like G.G. Allen, right? You know G.G. Allen?
I don't.
G.G. Allen is an example of an extreme debasement of an individual. His performances featured him smearing himself in excrement, fighting with the audience members. He was on the, I think, Oprah show, and he said, "My body is a rock and roll temple, and I'm offering my discharge as like sacrament." I mean, and this guy was a mess. He was threatening to kill himself on stage. But that's an example of an extreme implementation of just lower nature, you could say animalistic nature. And we'll maybe go into him a little bit later, but I mean, I'm sure we all know people or have examples of people following their not bliss per se, but their pleasure. It just ended up being absolutely debased, animalistic human beings. And so Plato and Aristotle talked about how music informs the movement of the body as well, right? Music informs how you use your body in space, and also that relates to how you act in accordance with either they describe as a rationally developed, philosophically based outlook, or an outlook based on more of a free for all and things like that. So basically, for the science of music was looked upon as the grounding of the political system, even more so than the laws. Again, this is Plato and Aristotle. And Aristotle, quote from him, he said that the most important for rearing children, music is most sovereign. Music is the most important element in rearing the new generation. It is the most fundamental means to not only develop the intellect, but develop emotional control and develop rationality and perception, intellect, awareness, and ultimately you could say a higher nature or more aesthetically tuned nature. And he said that the guardians of the regime, quote, must beware of changes to a strange form of music, for never are the ways of music changed without the greatest political laws being moved. Okay? So, and we can see that very distinctly in what we've looked at, and even the artificial ends of particular eras, right? You look at the end of 50s rock, 1959. You look at the end of the hippie movement, 1969. Very direct events occurred, right? You look at disco, the blowing up of the disco records in the stadium, etc. So it's easy to see that an introduction of a new music was understood historically to be a means of transforming the social body. And we'll get into that a bit more with some of the bioenergetic theories of music coming from the Princeton Radio Project and other researchers. But yeah, so that just, I think, hopefully will give a sense that that the excessive passion, the excessive unrestrained indulgence in certain types of behavior can be directly influenced by music. And just as a little tangent, very interesting thing I came across, and I'd seen this study. There was a small town, I think it was in Pennsylvania. There was a massive outbreak of sexually transmitted diseases among these, 13 to 15-year-old high school students, right? They were having group sex. They're having every kind of sex that you could imagine. They're all listening to hip hop. And in fact, they said, well, this influences us, but we just like to beat. But it was a massive cluster. We're talking about, like, I forget, almost the entire school was infected with like syphilis, gonorrhea, et cetera. And the music itself was an important part of that. And even the videos that go along with that, and we'll get into that in the third part. When you add that, you have an extremely powerful combination.
And we showed a little bit of that, debasement with Keisha and some of the other artists that we showed in part one. And I do recommend that those of you who haven't seen part one, go check that out.
Yeah. And from the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle, he says, quote, one's capacity for moral reasoning and choice is disrupted by excessive passion. So, so I think it's pretty clear to see that, while I think it's good to be a passionate person, I think I'm pretty passionate, maybe not right now, but excessive passion, this is, a lot of these things have been termed as, highly conservative, as blocking the natural development of the human being. But the fact is that if you look at our society, I don't think the fruits of the rock and roll and cultural Marxist revolutions have been very good. I don't know. What do you think, Jan?
Yeah, well, if you had asked me 5 or 10 years ago, I would have said, Hans, that's ridiculous. But now I got to admit, I look out there and I see it everywhere, and we discussed how, in the first episode, how they create, basically, you're given a military uniform for each group, each type of music, and so you have all of this divide and conquer, separation, division of family, and causing that division with children and their music, etc. And yeah, I don't think that much of it has been good. Now, somebody asked after the first one, well, what about hip-hop artists like KRS-One and some of these guys who put in a more positive, quote-unquote, political message? Does it really change things with the hip-hop beat, or what would you say there?
I mean, it really does depend. I mean, when we get into a little more direct analysis of music, there is certain music, right, that has a positive message. But one example, you can see some of these hip hop artists, right, even if they start out, I'm sorry, I forgot the guy's name, a rapper who did something. He did a rap about Gaza, very politically charged, music. And then after a couple of years, now he's singing about the same stuff, right? And so, it's possible that there is a positive message in that. The thing is, you have to watch out for is that if this artist themselves will be transformed, if people begin, I discussed this before, someone begins to relate to an artist and you can take them through transformations. What better example than Britney Spears, Disney, right? Hannah Montana to, the uber, sex maniac. And this is, people are following, they're locked into it. It's like a sales pitch, right? The guy gets you to go through the threshold, you're going to buy it. Oh, and then let's just push it and push it and push it. So, I haven't listened excessively to KRS-One. I did work with Chuck D from Public Enemy. And so I feel like he seems like a very good guy and has a pretty positive attitude. And even Professor Griff has done, some research on that. I mean, Professor Griff, his research methodologies may be a bit questionable, but I think his heart's in the right place. He has some good thoughts. I mean, he's definitely related to this everything's from Africa. I think original. I don't know if he's so much into the original tribes of Israel from Africa, but he's very Afrocentric, which is fine. But he definitely, I think he's got some very good points, especially in the hip hop world. So like an artist like Chuck D, I think, I felt like he's a good person, and he's still, I mean, doing music that can uh, have a positive influence. Now, whether or not the actual sonal qualities, right? You could say the biopsychology of how that music is affecting people has a negative quadrant. That's debatable.
That's totally separate from. Okay, so let's say you're trying to do your homework and you have KRS-One playing in the background. Are you still going to have that block from learning, even though his lyrics are positive, because the beat is still going to be that hip hop rap type beat?
Well, one thing I will get into when we talk about rhythm is when you look at rhythm, right? Rhythm and time. And so I'm kind of jumping ahead here, but rhythm is a way of dividing time. And it's also related to the psychological present, which means what is the maximum amount of material you can hold in your mind at which is perceived to be like one moment, right? For example, if you're playing a sport, there's a period of time. If I'm throwing a football or whatever, that time's going to slow down, right? That's all going to be one instant. But it actually expands your threshold for awareness to a great degree, especially music with much more longer, complicated structures, and music that has much more developed uses of rhythm, right? So if you look at classical music, you're going to have constant meter changes and constant time changes, right? So the time is really used as an element of an expression of sort of a unified conception going into the symphony. If you look at Indian music, which we'll talk about, you have these talas, which it's a very different way of perceiving time. It's a nonlinear, it's a cyclical mode of temporal perception, which allows you to really expand that psychological present, which means that it really increases your attention span and very much increases your awareness, and also in a sense gives you a greater degree of immunity, right, to these little embedded things. A lot of times it's very small things that are being perceived subconsciously that add up through repetition that have the worst effect. Now, if you go and look at a hip hop beat or even the standard doom clack, you look at that time frame, doom clack, doom, that's it, right? And it maybe the song is going to have lyrics, but the actual temporal frame is extremely narrow. Doom that, doom that, doom that, doom that, doom. Techno, doom. Okay, that's even so. It's really, I mean, you could say, the tech in the techno tribalist, the techno church, so to speak, because this is viewed very much as a religious ceremony. You look at techno, they look at this. My friend of mine actually did an extensive documentary on techno, interviewed people all over the world. It was pretty interesting, but they really viewed that as, or probably still do, view it as the evolution of the consciousness transformation of the 60s, and looked at the DJ like he's a priest in front of his altar, and the sacrament they take, whether ecstasy or whatever, and then the music itself is a means to induce this trance state. So these beats, these kind of beats, which I'll hopefully get into, this actually, if you look at rock, this comes from Voodoo. It comes from Santeria. It comes from African tribal drumming, which was used to cause possession and summon specific deities into people's bodies, right? So there are specific rhythmic beats that were associated with different deities. And through these rhythms, what people would become possessed by the god or whatever and do various things. And I saw this myself in India when I was living with the village in the Himalayas, that they used specific rhythms to induce these trance states. And so when you look at hip hop or rock, you're really looking at a music that developed from religious rituals. At least some of these rhythms developed to induce trance. Okay.
And I want to interject there that people need to understand that trance is synonymous with hypnosis. So you are getting hypnotized when you're involved in that, and then that, of course, is sold as part of the religious experience because you're hypnotized, and then they tell you essentially what to expect to feel.
Yeah, exactly. And and there is, you can describe, there is a level of aesthetic experience, right? You can be transported by music. I mean, music can resonate through your body, and if it's a positive music, it can sort of put you in a different state of mind. But one thing you notice is that there's usually even in Indian music or in Western classical music, there's definitely a very strong intellectual component. There's a strong component of the mind, right, that's operating, right? You have to really, this is music that takes understanding. It's like understanding a complex subject like physics. So it's not something that you can get an initial experience from it, but it does also use the mind. It uses the mind to perceive these patterns and complexity, so it really has a very positive effect. But the trance induction is something that can certainly produce a very real and a very direct effect. And in fact, we look at rock music. This was a stated aim of many performers. For example, Ray Manzarek described the Doors as shamans. They were a shamanistic group that was relating back to the ancient world and connecting, this sort of modern stream with this ancient shamanic.
The archaic revival or the native revivalism.
Yeah, I mean, that's a component of it. But also, if you look at something like techno or even hip hop, even if you don't know, if you're doing your homework, it is putting part of you into a trance, and it's going beyond the filter of your normal consciousness, which means all kinds of things can be embedded, all kinds of messages, all kinds of even psychological, physiological effects. I mean, we get into a little bit the Beatles and stuff. When I looked at some of their music, I found that, you can directly look at how this song is using hypnotic suggestion, using dissonance to cause tension, creating, lyrical message. You could look at the whole song as a hypnotic construction that's designed, and where's it leading you? And the fact is, like I gave the example of Gigi Allen, this can lead you to a very, very dark place. So, but.
All right, should we get into I guess we've covered the other two. Should we get into the basics of music?
Okay, well, let me just talk a little about music and healing modalities. So how music works with healing. And so there has been a major body of work done on music and healing modalities. I've been involved a little bit on some studies and even in a tertiary way. But one example is for Alzheimer's patients, having them sing, improvement of dementia, improvement of emotional balance, improving your level of articulation, improving your understanding of language and words and speech, improving long and short-term memory, even helping with pain reduction. And so there's, many, many studies look even at unborn babies and the effect music would have on unborn children. And they found strengthening of the immune system and also their behavior. They're more quiet. The infants were more calm after they were born. They were able to develop more quickly and also help their parents. So, and in fact, because of the vibrational nature of music, frequencies, there's something called vibroacoustic therapy where you lie on a bed and certain frequencies are just played through your whole body. And sometimes they've used this. We talked about infrasound, being used as a weapon. It can also be used as a healing device too. So these inaudible infrasonic frequencies can also be used as healing modalities. And so, really, music is something that's still not completely understood how it works on the brain and the body, and it really gets you to that base problem of consciousness, or you could say the soul, or whatever. What actually makes all these perceptions work together, and how does it work? But basically, I mean, music should be seen. For example, they used 30 hertz frequencies on Parkinson's patients and allowed them to regain movement and things like that. So I mean, again, this is a huge subject, but there is pretty massive body of research that shows that music, if used properly, has tremendous abilities. And just as a side note on that, even the education where you used to have to learn how to read music and just be basically musical literate. And that it's found that musicians listen much more in a left brain, a little more analytically, a little more rationally to music, but at the same time, their spatial perception is developed and also their ability to understand complex arguments, things like that, be able to follow, reading, literacy, and things like that. So, again, there's quite a lot of, studies to indicate that music has immense potential for that.
All right, basics of music. Let's get into, you want to start off with tone?
Okay. Yeah, so when we look at music, the first thing is how do we define or divide music from noise, right? You have a noise rock, you have things that are not necessarily considered to be musical sound, but there is a certain threshold where a sound wave in our brain takes shape as a tone. So we hear a note, we hear a specific pitch, a specific frequency. So tones are it relates to basically the amount of noise within a frequency and how much the frequency is sort of tightened up to include that, right? And so tone itself is, when you're talking, you have speech tones and things like that, but it's still not singing. And so this production of tone with the body is really the ability to produce these kind of honed audio waveforms, sonic waveforms that they start to have a real effect on the body and the mind. I'm not a great singer. I'm not going to sing I can't sing, but I'm not going to do it on the podcast. But basically, so, and then from tone, go ahead.
You know what? I just realized your video switched back to full screen. I hope that didn't screw things up in the video recording. Let me just check it real quick. All right, let's get into scale.
Okay, so once you have a tone, right, then that tone itself, which was discovered by Pythagoras and probably others before him, but basically each tone, a single frequency actually has many, many different overtones. So within a single pitch, a single tone, there are multiple other vibrating frequencies, and that's known as the overtone series. And from that, we start to derive intervals. So I think I gave you a picture. One of those graphs I sent you has a picture of that series. So basically, from this overtone series, and basically from our tone, we start to find corollaries and relationships between certain notes, frequencies, and other notes, right? So, and from this, we get something known as the octave. Okay, and the octave is you can find a lot about the law of octaves. Gurdjieff talked about the entire manifestation of creation as being derived from higher and higher octaves or vibrational sequences. But the octave is a very interesting phenomenon in sound and in nature, and it's actually the octave that allows all of music to develop. And so basically what the octave is, you have one pitch and you go up approximately 1,200 cycles per second, and then you get another note that is exactly like that note. It's at a higher scale, but it's the same note. And from these two boundary points, we can build our scales and begin to derive them. So let me just show you. Basically, here's an octave. So that's C. I played the note C, and all of those notes basically there's a repetition. There's a natural cyclical law where these frequencies at a higher register, it's actually the same. It's the same tone, but it's at a higher higher pitch. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So now within these octaves, you might want to just edit this. We'll move over here. So when we have our octave, we begin to break that octave into different components, right? So our basic scale, a major scale, that octave has now been broken up into 7 distinct pitches, and that can be played in any other key, which means any other pitch. So if I start from a different note, and I actually changed the mode there. I went from the Ionian to the Lydian scale. But from these octaves, which is again the law of octave, you have the ability to take these basic divisions, construct melodies, and in fact the whole derivation of harmony comes from that. So let me just go over the basic modes, and these are from, we find actually, as I mentioned, I've read Plato's discussion of these modes, but these modes are basic scales which related to different tribes in Greece, ancient Greece, and their different temperaments, right? So each scale was named after a different group and showed their characteristics. And certain modes Plato felt to be not conducive for a properly functioning society and other things. But so let me just show you these modes here. So we start out, we have derived our scale. Now I can take that exact same relationship between the notes, and let me just sidetrack and talk a little about intervals. So an interval is a distance between two pitches. If you have, this octave is known as a 12th, but that's the, you could say the space between these notes. And these different intervals either blend together, they're either consonant or they're dissonant. So the most closely blended interval with the tonic is the 5th. And the 4th. So those are the most consonant intervals, which means that these two frequencies are more harmonized. And then the opposite of that, you have dissonance. So if I play the most dissonant interval, a minor second, right? And those two frequencies, they're clashing, so you can hear that. Those are called beats in between those pitches. And that's actually how, well, binaural beats actually works on the same principle. But, so we have these basic intervals, and we take the same 7-note scale, and we start from the second degree of the scale, and play the same notes. We get Dorian. You can hear there's a different effect from that scale, right? Compare that to the major scale. So from all of these modes, they're derived different scales. Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Ionian, etc. So basically, from these modes, from this basic principle of acoustics, right? The principle of the octave, deriving what you're doing in between these boundaries of the octave is how you get your scale, right? And there are all different kinds of scales. You have microtonal tunings. You have Arabic music with quarter tones, etc., which is a whole different subject. But you also have an example is a pentatonic scale, which has 5 notes. Now, if you notice, almost all of our popular music is based on at least blues, a lot of the rock and stuff is based on pentatonic scales, which we find mostly associated with folk music and things like that, country music. And so this basic 5-note scale that's an example of a 5-note scale. The blues scale, which is pretty much the basis of about 98% of all rock guitar solos, not 90, but quite a lot, which is a minor pentatonic. That's an example of a pentatonic scale. But basically, scales are from these basic building blocks. We have the derivation of the entire system of music. And again, I won't go into Plato's discussion on the different modes, but it's very, very interesting. He's talking about, like, for example, the Lydian mode. He's saying this will have this kind of effect on the society. It should not be used. We should promote this music for our enemies so they'll, become destabilized. So there's definitely a great understanding of this. They're also known as the church modes because these were played in, the early development of Western music. You have like Gregorian chants and things like that. And if anyone's ever listened to a Gregorian chant, you notice these use of these fourths and fifths, right? And these intervals, which are very consonant and kind of induce more of a calm state or a peaceful state.
Very interesting. All right, timbre.
Okay. Well, yeah, timbre. Before I get to timbre, let me just show one other thing. So from these scales, and again, this is coming from the overtone series, we can start to build chords. A little bit of Louie Louie, 1, 4, 5, which.
Oh, I was just gonna say, any audio distortion is due to Skype and not to the playing there. We are getting some warbling in the audio on occasion, so I just wanted to mention that. Go ahead.
Yeah. So basically, like that's when you take your scale and then you can take those intervals and you can start to build chords, and then we get something known as chord progressions. Right, and so chord progression, this is a very interesting way that when you perceive music, it does sort of take you on a journey, right? Because these chords create feelings of tension and release. So in a sense, you're going through, it's almost like you watch a film that has different dramatic arcs in a film. So chord progression can actually affect you, maybe not in an intellectual level, but in a perceptual level, you will feel this tension and release. And the bass, as I mentioned, the fourth and fifth scale degrees are the most consonant, which means they relate most well with our fundamental pitch on the tonic. So we take, right? So there's a resolution there. So there's a sense of returning home after going to a different place, right? But if you look at rock music, for example, you do find that there is a very, very, not always, right? There's always exceptions. But if you look at even the beginning of early rock, it was using very, very basic, simple chord progression, simple harmony. If you compare that to, say, jazz, which had a much more highly elaborate system, using much more detailed and, say, advanced song structures and chordal harmony, it does have a different effect. And in fact, Frank Sinatra testified to the Senate against rock music because he thought probably was stealing his market, but also he felt that it was demeaning and debasing the youth of the country, which, if you asked me that a couple of years ago, I would have probably argued, but now I'm debating that. But the fact is that these harmonic progressions do have effects on the mind. But if you do notice, say in hip hop, for example, almost a complete removal of even that element of music, right? So there's barely any harmony. There's no even actual chord progression. So you don't even have that interest for the mind. And in effect, when you simplify and take away these elements from music, you also affect the minds of the listeners, in a sense, simplify their perceptions unless they're able to break out of that, right? But okay, so that's a little bit on harmony, but timbre is why different instruments sound differently, right? So timbre relates to the tone of an instrument, how it sounds. So this is not the greatest keyboard, but so I go to an organ. So that has a different timbre, which means that there are different harmonics that you can hear within that, right? If you take a basic pure sine wave and you start stacking them, that's how synthesis works, basically. You stack these sine waves and get different timbres, different instrument tones. And I don't think it's necessary for me to go through and play a bunch of different sounds on my Casio keyboard, but basically timbre is why someone's voice sounds more appealing, because of the overtones in their voice, right? Or a flute has a very pure tone. It's much closer to a sine wave. An electric guitar has a very distorted tone, right? A French horn, flugelhorn, things like that. So the principle of timbre relates to these frequencies, and in fact, the orchestral tradition is based on a very advanced, over centuries into the possibilities of timbre, of how different instruments work together and create different kind of experiences, different kind of fields, different kind of emotions. But so does that make sense? Kind of a brief.
Yeah, it makes sense. I had to mute my mic as a big truck was going by. So
okay. Yeah. So, but timbre, if we look at timbre also, we can see that when I get into some of the Soviet research on psychotronic weapons and sound, the use of certain types of distorted frequencies, of certain types of distorted noise, and how that can affect the mind. Also, within a tone, you can embed other frequencies, right? A frequency can be a carrier wave for other tones. And there's a phenomena of masking, which is basically where your mind will block out certain things you're hearing, right? Your mind will, for example, there may be a piano part and you're going to hear the lead voice. You're not really going to hear those other parts. They're almost invisible to your perception, right? So that also relates with timbre and the nature of perception within music.
We ready for rhythm?
Yeah. So rhythm basically is the creation of specific pulsed events in time with some kind of a structure, right? So rhythm is another aspect of music that is also very, very potent, right? And rhythm serves to bring the mind and body into entrainment, which I talked about briefly. Entrainment, again, is the principle of two vibrating bodies to begin to phase lock, right? So there's a phase lock. So the rhythm actually can lock into our heartbeats. It can lock into our blood pressure and all kinds of things like that. But the basis of rhythm is a repeated sound over time. And let's pause it right there for a second, Jan. So I'm going to demonstrate a few things about rhythm on the drum set here. But with rhythm, we have a number of different factors. First of all, we have the way the time is being divided, right? So the general grouping in Western music is a measure, which is going to be composed of a certain number of beats. This is also known as meter, right? So you can have a group of 4 beats, 3 beats, 5 beats, 7 beats, etc., right? And if you hear, for example, just a clicked pulse, your mind will actually start to group those beats Yeah, so we're discussing rhythm, and so and I mentioned that rhythm is a way of ordering events in time, right? So, and rhythm really applies in, it's not obviously not just in music, but the temporal ordering of events, and also the emphasis of events, right? So, like say, for example, Ericksonian hypnosis, you use embedded commands in sentences. Like, I really feel like donations, if you would like to send my,
Right.
I'm
Like
not very good at doing that.
NLP and NVC and all that stuff.
Yeah, but that's related to the emphasis of the word. And I slow my speech rate, or I talk very quickly, changing an effect, right? So the rhythmic effects are all around us, right? But in terms of music, I've got my set of tabla here. I'm going to demonstrate. So one basic aspect is meter. So meter is how you're dividing time into a specific, a unit, a structural unit, right? So if I just hit that sound with no accent, you're hearing something, but it's not really organized in any way, right? But with rhythm, I can group the rhythmic events into a numerical structure. Say, for example, if I'm going to play in 3, this is in 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4. And I can do 10. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. Right? So that's known as meter. And if you look at a music notation, you'll see a measure. There's 2 numbers, like a fraction. The upper number is the number of beats in a measure, right? And the lower number is, I reverse that. The lower number is the number of beats in the measure, and the upper number is the division. So a quarter note would mean there's 4 quarter notes in a measure, 4 eighth notes. And again, you can divide time and subdivide it into smaller and smaller units or longer and longer units. But all those divisions are dependent on the frame, right? So if your framework is a particular pattern in this sequence, then I would divide the notes based on that overall framework. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, and then from that, we get something known as a rhythmic grid. And the rhythmic grid is, if you listen to a song, like say you listen to a pop song, and you hear there's, right? This is lowest level of the rhythmic grid in that song. That's like your quarter note. So like, okay? And then you have other tiers. You may have a rhythm guitar. Then you have a higher level of speed as well, that can be part of that. So any song, you can kind of break it down based on this rhythmic grid in terms of where people are fitting in on that, right? If you listen to Latin music, you hear a cowbell, and you can hear instruments that are accessing a lower part, which means a slower rhythm, different densities, right? So you can stack these types of density, of rhythmic density. And so the effect of rhythm is actually, as much as a melody or a song or a chord or scale can affect you, because that can affect your emotions. Rhythm, you could say, is more of a Dionysian effect, right? It has more of a trance-inducing or intoxicating effect. An example of that was The Rite of Spring, Stravinsky. First time he performed that piece, there was massive riots in Paris. And this had this rhythm, which you hear all the time. And so that is used all the time in film soundtracks, right? But that rhythm was such a dramatic effect on the audiences that they rioted. Just like you can look at Elvis Presley shows, you can look at, Little Richard, even conservative icon of rock music, Bill Haley, right? Mr. Rock Around the Clock. People were rioting at these shows, a large portion due to the effect of the rhythm, especially if you're not used to it, right? If you've never heard these kind of rhythms before, they can have a very immediate and drastic effect on the body and mind. But also in terms of rhythm, so there's also the interlocking or nature of a rhythm. You can have very complicated rhythmic patterns known as polyrhythms, where you're stacking two different rhythms on top of each other. Let's see. Is that sort of a simple demonstration there, but I've got like a different rhythm going with the left hand and the right hand. So that's a polyrhythm found a lot in African music. And another aspect of rhythm that's very important is syncopation. And syncopation is really something that came in with jazz and actually with, you could say, the African influence in American music. That first started primarily in the church. The cakewalk is an example, a very interesting piece of history where there was a dance that was performed by the slaves where they would mock their masters in the way they danced, in the way they moved their body. People saw it, and then it became a popular dance form in America. It was actually done as a mockery, the way, because obviously you've seen African dance, it's a lot more dramatic and embodied than, Victorian ballroom dancing. But that's an example of a rhythm, but then even through that, the natural syncopation crept into the dance forms, right? But syncopation basically means if you have a beat, 1, 2, 3, then you have offbeats. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4. Which is basically you're playing offbeat. It gives a little bit of tension or a little bit of a lift. You feel that if everything's going da 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 like jazz. It's all syncopation. So that syncopation is something that also can have a very strong effect because you're sort of flipping the pattern. That your brain is kind of locking into a pattern and you're kind of flipping that grid about, by adding these offbeats that are kind of unexpected. And that, again, just as in harmony, where you can have harmonic tension through dissonance. Dissonance, right? You can have rhythmic tension through elements like syncopation and stuff like that. So any questions on that?
No, but you can definitely feel the the effect that each one has on you as you're playing it. But instead of just tapping along, it's like, okay, now the mind is paying attention to the specific effects that each specific beat has on the mind and body. So
yeah, and then the thing is, it actually becomes kind of enjoyable, right? If you can understand, you can listen. You're not just a passive, you're not absorbing this stuff passively through your subconscious, right? You're able to a little bit see what's going on and then also notice the placement of stuff, you know what I mean, and things like that. So then you get a better understanding of what actually is happening. Like, how's this working?
Yeah.
And it makes it more interesting. And so when we look at rhythm, actually rhythm can also synchronize mental processes. That's what's very interesting. It's not just bodily motion, but mental processes can be synchronized through rhythm, right? And it doesn't, as I said before, it doesn't necessarily have to be music. The rhythm of someone speaking, you can entrain. You have a demagogue, in front of an audience, I mean, look, the great public speakers, and they're using the rhythm also there's an element of rhythmic entrainment that can be used to lock in with emphasis, and also to bring that entire motion of their brain, what they are thinking of, to change, right? I mean, and there's been a lot of really fascinating studies on this, which is where there's a rhythm. They had the test subjects were watching video, like images flash before them, right? And they were inserting these like little subliminal quick pictures. And when that subliminal picture fell on the beat, they didn't notice it. When it did not align with the beat, they were much more able to notice these images, right, that were happening. And so they weren't even told. They just had a beat, a 4/4 beat playing in the background, and then they were shown these images. And so the brain's decision-making process was actually connected with that rhythm right there. And so it also shows, though, how the images, or this rhythm, can work with images, can work with, again, you have photic driving, which is use of light sources, all this stuff working together. And if you watch modern music videos, it's just kind of like a textbook example of all these quick cuts, flashing lights, all this stuff working together. And that's something that, if you really start to analyze it, it's if you think people are doing this stuff on purpose, it's pretty disturbing, But
you mean if you know that they're doing it on purpose is pretty disturbing, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole thing. Oh,
I'm sure that some minor movie production people wouldn't know about this, but you got to think that there's got to be a lot of them that really do get this stuff.
Oh, of course. I mean,
they didn't develop this and then make all the notes of the meeting, and we haven't even gone into that yet. Totally missing. In fact, when we get to A440, we'll go into that whole thing as well. But yeah, so you want to switch to the morphology of ensembles?
Okay. Yeah, let me just finish up a little bit more. In terms of our visual circuits are actually connected with our perception of rhythm, right? So this part of our brain, the electrical activity in the brain, it begins to connect with the oscillations of the auditory rhythm. And so this also, again, affects how we process images, and also also how our relationship to all the other events we're seeing, right? So what I'm trying to say is that the entire neurological processing of all different sensory inputs and thoughts can begin to oscillate along with this driving rhythm.
Yeah, and going back to your idea, about people synchronizing their heart rates, etc., and all this stuff can happen even more so with music. So when you start going through the last 100 years of music, you begin to see a pattern. And I mentioned, I think, to you that, listening on satellite radio, they have, you can listen to the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s, and there's a definite shift or change in the music in each decade. And you can see, the question becomes, is art mimicking reality, or is reality being changed by the art intentionally? And they are in basic decade periods, that, like you were saying, the 50s music ends in 59, and then 69, and then the disco era in 79. Then you've got the 80s new wave music coming in and all of this stuff. It looks like they're using this to keep the society as a whole in a specific mode of thought or progression, essentially. And they use the music of each era to harmonize that movement in the society.
Yeah, no, and that is a valid point, which, I have come, which I'll talk at the end of this, about the research again of the radio project and how they worked with shaping how societies could be changed and molded through music. But if you do look at it, I mean, and I have all these participants, you have all these record executives, you have all these different governmental, military people are all participating, through these Rockefeller funded grants to do this stuff. And then if you start looking at the distribution and the production of music, who's in charge of that? And you look at how certain artists are promoted and other artists are neglected, that you really see that, a lot of times this is blamed on lowest common denominator, right? Okay, well, I want to make money. So I'm going to go ahead and, write songs. Well, I have an example. It's extremely grotesque, but I'll just bring it up, of the cross connection, because you really have to look at all these media sources being connected. So I mentioned to you or somewhere else, this, to me is a pretty unappealing practice of analingus, right? Which is, it showed up, there was a salon.com article about it showing up in a show. And then there's a around the same time, Nicki Minaj has a song about that as well. Exact same time, this, you say debased practice is showing up in two media forms. Oh, just accidental.
Well, it's like going back to the article I wrote with Joe Atwill, Manufacturing the Deadhead. We see Edward Bernays coming in and marketing the whole promotion of sex and theater and everything. And then, of course, there's this constant progression and further degradation. It's like, one is always trying to beat the other one, and how low can you go? Wasn't there a Simpsons or a South Park episode or something all based on, how low can you go? And they have this scuba diver going like down as far as he could, I don't remember, it was years ago, but going back to Edward Bernays, we can see that it's the intentional degradation of society that they're promoting, and using the music and the theater and these various art forms to push it to the next level. And so, the first time it happens, the society is shocked and upset. And then the next time, and then they do it again, or you see it happening, like you were saying, in a couple places at the same time. But, the next time they do it, they're going to be less shocked and then less shocked, and then it will, and then it becomes part of the societal norm to have this degraded behavior.
Yeah. And this is, you say, this kind of the mass alchemical processing of humanity, right? This is...
Yeah. Yes. And of course, Crowley and all these guys, Crowley was MI6, and they were all in MK Ultra and all of this stuff, where a lot of this technology was developed.
Yeah, no, and what's really fascinating is that when you look at the development of all these things, you find these, like, again, bring up the Harold Burris Meyer was a very important person, was a behaviorist, right? And he deliberately set about and was funded to use music to induce mass hysteria, music as a mode of social control, and worked in theater, developed all kinds of different speaker systems, like you look at Fantasia, the merging of image, light, sound, and technology. So all this was developed in this radio project. And then you look at all this technology and all this stuff suddenly being out of nowhere. You had these strobe light shows and all the psychedelic light shows with these, and you have it today in the modern techno show of this auditory and photic driving, which is directly coming out of these research projects, and you got Lazenfeld and all these same guys, Rand Corporation, again, and then Burris Meyer, they said he got a little bit too out there in terms of his ambitions of controlling society, and he had Adorno as more the Marxist supposed betterment of the masses, and so a Rockefeller Foundation got rid of him. But he gets hired by the U.S. Navy to work on the same technology, and then he worked with the Muzak Corporation developing environmental music to work on the arousal levels and change, behavioral patterns, increase productivity. In fact, they designed all this music for all different kinds of environment. You want people to shop, you want people to be calm, you want people to be quiet. And what's really interesting too is your spatial. They've done studies of people trying to discuss projects, and there's certain kinds of noise in the environment, and they cannot function. They change the you change these little noise factors, boom, they can function, because actually the perception of again, it's a spatial temporal awareness, which is I think really being stripped from us on a day-by-day basis, that this kind of serves as a model of. But anyways, so yeah, it's really interesting, and yeah, and I will go a bit more into all these different genres and how. So the thing is that you need key nodes, you need nodal points, right? You need particular change agents, right? And these change agents can influence a lot of other people, and even small decisions can. You got these same guys distributing LSD in Britain and then distributing it in England and America, etc. So.
And I was just thinking of, for instance, going back to trance and techno, Goa Gill, and he goes over to Goa, India with Leary and these guys, and then he comes back and he's like the pioneer of a lot of this techno shamanism, this hardcore trance, and then he's also famous with the DAT decks and for his train wrecks in the middle of his shows, which would be an interruption if you think about it in terms of neurolinguistic programming or in terms of rhythms and interruptions and trance hypnosis, all of this type of stuff. It gives a whole new, it gives a higher view of very possibly what was going on there. And then, of course, Goa Gill is always famous for having dishes of LSD up, right in front of the deck. With for free LSD for everybody at these rave parties. So, just an association I thought there with all of that you were talking about.
Yeah, no, and that's exactly right. For example, in NLP, you want to install a trigger, right? So whether you're installing a trigger on someone else, you're doing a conversational trigger. Like I say, Jan, you're really great. Jan, this is the greatest podcast ever. Jan, you're great. And so something like that, if I say an emotional word and I touch my eye, right, and I'm installing a trigger, but then you also have to break the trigger. You have to do something else. You have to, in order for the trigger to be installed, you kind of have to have this interruption or this break, right? And then it's installed. And you see Leary and these guys, they are so transparently promoting this idea of freedom. And this is the ethos of rock and roll. If it's too loud, you're too old. Rock is the music of rebellion. Rock is the music of our generation. Rock distinguishes us from our parents. But then how much of this conflict between the generations, this intergenerational warfare, which accelerated and was, which was encoded in the music and the lifestyle. You look at these seminal movies, again, like Blackboard Jungle. You look at Easy Rider. These movies coming out at the same time as these movements are launched and stuff like that. And then also you have this facet, which I wanted to mention a little bit earlier, was how George Harrison was talking about how My Sweet Lord, he said it's very simple, it's this nice soft pop song, and by the time the Alleluia has shifted to Hare Krishna, it's too late. You've been captured by the song, and he's embedding this Krishna consciousness in the masses, very deliberately putting that in a song. And I don't have anything against Krishna consciousness per se, but I'm saying that he took that song, My Sweet Lord, and he said directly, this is an innocuous pop song that people will hear, and then you got, oh, hallelujah, and then suddenly they're singing Hare Krishna, and you've already been entrained by that song. You're being subtly influenced by that. And if you look at Bill Haley's a fascinating guy because he did every single musical genre you could think of, right? He he was like he was a total businessman. Did country and western. He tried to do jazz. And he was, but then he did rock and roll. And because he was a middle-aged, kind of paunchy 40-year-old white guy singing rock around the clock, the parents accepted him. He put an acceptable face on this music, right? That was essentially a massive onslaught on the values of 1950s America, whether or not you agree with those values or not. But and rock and roll, of course, meant sex. Rock around the clock. What's that? I mean, it doesn't take it doesn't take Einstein or
I'm not sure if Einstein's a good example, but
that's why I was. Well, that's exactly. It doesn't take a Kepler to figure that out. But but the same thing in that what you were saying about these triggers, these interruptions and breaks, right? So if you look at, you have these shocks also, right? You have these patterns being implemented. And for example, you have Bill Haley, who's still a clean cut guy. Then suddenly you have Elvis doing the rock and roll. And Elvis is like a shock. And then you have some, reaction to it, et cetera, et cetera. So then, you're able to see in a certain extent how these mass psychological processes are being undertaken on just these vast scales with even just a few key agents, right? That are in there, And anyways, it's a very interesting, fun subject.
So for all you occultists out there who can't get it together to figure out how come your gigantic cult isn't working for you, this is kind of all explaining it. Unfortunately, it's a double-edged sword putting this out for those, with nefarious intent. They'll be like, aha, but at the same time, at least it levels the playing field somewhat for others to understand it and protect themselves from all of this.
Yeah, and also even to, use music as a way to, empower yourself. Use music as a way even to try to, create your own music to have more of a community. It can be a way to rebuild communities. And I was thinking about this, that, some people, wrote me and everything, is music all bad? No, but then think about the music you're listening to is mass produced in a mass media that is being basically rammed down your throat and is being mass wide dissemination. I mean, even Bob Dylan, the rebel, this guy is in the cover of all these, every single major magazine, promoting, even though he's initially singing some kind of nice folk songs, he was promoting all kinds of values. Like there's one, I think it's from 1962, The Village Voice, and he's saying, the kind of girl I like a dirty girl who has hair coming out from all parts of her body, who drops out of school. And that's
all right. Okay. Let me interject right there, because the Village Voice, or was that the East Village Other? One of those was run by Walter Boart, who wrote Operation Mind Control, and Marshall McLuhan was a regular feature of that one. So I don't know. Anyway, if it was it may have been the East Village Other, and I might be confusing the two. I'd have to go double check that.
Yeah, well. And I think this is how, in terms of really to pull the entrails out, because, we get in the next interview. I found a lot of very interesting stuff that I'll get into.
Well, we may have to put it, even another interview out at this point, because we're almost at 2 hours already here. Oh, wow. Well, I think, though, it's, there's so much material. It is kind of like a college course, and, that, but I think it's important to a little bit jump off the rails in terms of the outline, and just be able to touch base with different things. And sure.
Yeah, in fact, let me tie this right back into what I had on my list here, is the cantometric system of social analysis based on all these different factors of music developed by Alan Lomax. And this is one of the fundamental aims and agendas of a lot of these big research projects and this funding, was being able to, number one, to quantify the audiences, their effects, how the music was affecting them, being able to quantify all the different aspects of music, right? Being able to break this down, so you really have, again, you use your giant algorithmic, societal modeling computer. Obviously, this was done before then, but the idea is being able to quantify and put this stuff into very interesting patterns. And the Cantometrics describe. Oh, go ahead.
I just had another idea. When you think of rhythm and all, they're probably setting different rhythms, and then each time they change the type of music or whatever that's popular out in culture, it changes, it causes an interruption, and then changes things on a much larger scale. If we think it in terms of small scales and just scaling it outward, what would their largest scale be of something like that?
Yeah, I mean that's very that's where it's very interesting, because you can find a lot of stuff on the psychotronic weapons. You can find various things, but when you look at look, for example, Pavlov's research, and Pavlov begins working with Stalin. Very important component of his work is the tone, these different notes, right? These kind of things like that. And then you look at like these nursery rhymes and these children's music. That's when it gets really kind of a little bit disturbing. You're like, wow, wait, maybe, it's one thing, when you see these people are all hanging out in different clubs. It's another thing when you start to pull apart their methodology and realize that that it is quite possible that some of the more paranoid assertions can actually be empirically verified or validated.
Right, you're talking about like the so-called Christian right, et cetera, uproaring about this for the last several decades. You can actually go in and find that they were correct this whole time about that.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because one thing, that I came across in my work, and I have to tell you, Jan, I need hazard pay. I have to listen to all these modern artists, man. Oh, it's bad now. The music today, I sound like some old fogey. Unbelievably bad. But one thing that I noticed across the board is this massive assault on Christianity. Just full throttle. Unbelievable. Going from, John, from the Beatles, John Lennon. They hated Christianity. All these other things to all the different images of, just desecration and, et cetera. Just across the board, even when they're wearing the crucifix or something like that. So it's very interesting. That makes me think, I'm not really a practicing Christian, but it makes me think, well, maybe there's something to Christianity if it's been this massively assaulted.
Well, and get this. So I was doing research a week or two ago on the origins of the peace symbol, and now I probably have it in the database or whatever, but the peace symbol originates from taking an upside down cross and breaking it.
Wow.
Yeah. So, we have the music and the whole culture. They're doing the peace sign, or which, you see Satanists doing that also. So, peace is Satan, and then it's the peace logo is the broken cross. So, I found that to be really interesting. I spent, a few hours tracking that stuff down and going as far as I could with it, and very, very interesting.
Yeah, just you can get this image of the Yellow Submarine promo picture where John Lennon is doing the devil horns front and back. Paul McCartney is holding one of his eyes,
right?
And that's heavy metal heads. I thought that's like Ronnie James Dio, Motley Crue. But then why are the Beatles doing that? And they're doing it in multiple promo pictures. It's but these are in Indian. Philosophy, or you could say spiritual philosophy, these are hand gestures or mudras, right? Mudras have, in India, I believe, to have both an effect on the neural processing, right? You do a particular type of mudra, there's like Dhyan mudra and things like that. These are They create they're believed to create some kind of circuits in the body, but a mudra can also have an effect, an energetic effect on the perceiver, right? So if I give you the finger, which I would never do, Jan, by the way, but that's like a mudra, right? That's a visual gesture, and then when you tie all this stuff, you put it together with the gestures, etc. It really looks like, I mean, first of all, if Christianity is just old fuddy-duddy religion no one believes in, then why this massive assault?
Right. Well, exactly right. And, why all of the blatant promotion of Satanism against it, just like going back to Huxley and McLuhan and Larry's quotes that I published in my article in Theogen's What's in a Name last November. These guys are all focused on the Bible as well, and Huxley, Leary, McLuhan, they're all talking about how it's their largest obstacle to their MK Ultra agenda. And then when we see the peace sign and the music and all of these different things coming in, and what you're talking about, and this Keisha music with all of the blatant stuff, and now we're going to sound like Christian fanatics here, but neither of us are, and we're just saying from an outside point of view of these different religions what we're seeing going on, and it's blatantly obvious that the Christians are under extreme attack in the in the media and everything right now, because if you put it in context of this neo-feudalist society that they've been promoting, breaking culture, and especially Christian culture, which made the U.S. This big powerful empire and stuff. They want to break that and then return us all basically back to serfs in a neo-feudalist system that's essentially a Western analog of the Hindu caste system.
Yeah, no, that's really true. And then when you look at Aleister Crowley, which Crowley actually, thanks to Ozzy, I pronounce it wrong. Thanks, Ozzy. But Aleister Crowley, he stated, I think it was an early, forget what it was, like turn of the century. He basically stated he did some ritual where he gave up all of his all his powers he'd achieved and everything. He sacrificed everything in order to destroy Christianity. And his goal was to destroy Christianity. And there's some texts I found describing Crowleyan ritual, right? It sounds just like Woodstock, sounds like a rock concert, And so this sensibility, and then it's like, well, I'll just put another tangent here, but if you look at, I talked to you personally about, I went to this Santo Daime church thing, and that was really, and
that's one of the ayahuasca churches, for those who don't know, which is based on the psychedelic DMT-based substance, which anyway, there's two versions of it legal in the U.S., Santo Daime and the Uno de Vegetal.
Yeah, but this group, I mean, first of all, you have this music you have to sing, you have uniforms, you have to wear, white shirt, whatever. You have to, men and women are segregated, and you have to sing these hymns and like dance these, samba rhythms, trying to read Portuguese, and the music is going, and and then you look at that, and it's like, I mean, well, I had some very, I mean, I was in a farmhouse in like upstate Maryland, and I'll just say it on the air. What the hell? I saw Baphomet was like sitting right next to the guy when I went to get the drink. He was like sitting there smiling at me, and it was just like, it's not like I mean, that shouldn't have come in my mind, considering it was all sort of like a pseudo-Christian thing, but it was extremely disturbing. And then people were screaming, being possessed, and then I know personally people that have been destroyed by that. I mean, people have completely lost their minds. They're institutionalized. But you see the exact same thing of utilizing this rhythm, this uniform, this music on a micro scale. Another example, there's all kinds of examples of that. They spun off all these different little cult groups. In the early 70s, you have these little micro examples, exact same thing being applied to small groups and large group experimentation. And so that's something that's ostensibly Christian, so to speak. But I mean, it's leading you. I do have to say that we will probably talk about the occult stuff in more depth, because it's not just dumbing down. I think it's much more than dumbing down. It is also leading people into a very particular consciousness, but part of that is the destruction of values, destruction of morals, and there's a festival here in Ohio that's like an underground festival. I think it's called like the Do What You Want to Do Festival. And you go there, and everyone's tripping, and you can do whatever you want. One of my friends went there, or an acquaintance, and like people are stealing from other people, they're beating people up, but people get these flyers for this thing. And my other friend, who's ex-naval intelligence guy, he asked him to describe the location for him. This took place on an abandoned military base. The Do What You Want to Do hippie music festival, I think it's probably going on sometime this summer. And you're just like, it's like, oh, let's be part of this group mind control experiment. Yeah, let's just let's enjoy it for what it is. And but the thing is that it's not just enjoyment. When you can, how many people have? There's more casualties, I think, from the '60s drug revolution than from the Vietnam War. How many destroyed lives? How many people still? You want to look at a generation. Of course, a lot of great people came out of that, but the softening up for what's going on now, I don't think would have been possible without that cultural body blow of the 1960s, which was a shock.
All right, you want to get back to morphology of ensembles?
Yeah. So basically, any kind of ensemble, you can have different types of elements, which means what kind of elements you have. So this is a way of seeing also. This is also used in the cantometric system of Alan Lomax. And basically, you have monophonic, which is you have a single voice. So normally, I would give examples of it. But for example, you think of a folk singer or someone, just an unaccompanied voice, whatever. And then you have homophonic, which is not homophobic. Homophonic is where you have a chordal bass and a song. So most of our songs you're going to hear are going to be a chordal, like a chord progression, and then a melody going over it, right? So you basically have a melody and a chord progression. That's homophonic. Then you have heterophonic, where you have multiple instruments playing a similar yet different voice, right? So you hear that sometimes in like Indian classical music. That's heterophonic. Then you have polyphonic, which is where you have multiple voices. And that's what you hear in, say, J.S. Bach in Baroque music, kind of the more advanced classical music. You could sometimes hear that in, say, some types of jazz and things like that. But so these are the basic types of pretty much all the different types of putting together musical elements in an ensemble or a group. And then with rhythm, you can also analyze rhythm in a similar way, but you do look at the use of, even if you look at BPM cycles, not only A440 tuning, but the use of specific BPM cycles in pop music is also very, very important, right? So you not only have the organization of the rhythm in the song, but you also have the rhythm that these songs are used, the rhythms that are utilized. And then if you add in the elements, say with techno, you have a computer generated beat, right? So you have this sort of artificial rhythm that adds a whole nother layer to this whole thing, but I will touch on that later. But the cantometric system basically was a large scale survey that was undertaken, I think, late 50s. And it went and looked at all kinds of music from all over the world, thousands and thousands of songs. And it used and then this was correlated with all matter of sociological data, how the society functions, respect for authority in the society, economic system of the authority. How sexuality, sexually restrictive, sexually permissive, pretty much everything you can think of, ranging from organizations of local hunter-gatherers to large-scale societies. Okay, and so this survey quantified all the elements of rhythm, which I'll go over that briefly. So you have group organization. I have a chart here. Social organization is related to group organization. Vocal groups, solo, one part, two part. Rhythm relation, social organization with the orchestra, musical organization, vocal. Types of cohesiveness, rhythmic features, melodic features, phrase length, interval length, type of tones, tempo, dynamic features, ornamentation, vocal qualities, whether it's a nasal, like a nasal voice, like a bel canto voice, a raspy voice, an enunciated voice, and things like that. So this was done, and this data was correlated, again, 1,100 different societies. And they found a very, very strong correlation statistically with all of these. Again, all these things are coded, right, in numbers. So you're putting data together, coded with the social organization, types of features, types of production, how the types of settlements they had. Everything was correlated with this different types of music and how the music was organized and all these other musical features. Now you can apply this if you want to reverse engineer it, not saying that on Lomax. You can apply this and say, hey, what's happened here? Let's look at our music. Let's look at the cantometric scale and see how the music has changed, how this has influenced social organization, behavior, etc.
Interesting, especially when you think of like the U.S. 1800s. You've got lots of piano and there's a specific sound, and then that's kind of lasts for some time, I think, and people just playing individually and whatever music people made, and then you have the 1910s and 20s come along, and then it's just this constant pushing of these musical themes, always pushing it forward. And then, of course, techno goes right into Julian Huxley's transhumanism, etc.
Yeah, exactly. And the research on this, and given the time frame, I think we'll hold off. I'll do the A440 with the Indian music in a separate lecture talk. But if we have a little time, I do want to maybe go into some of the way that this stuff is utilized in terms of how the methodologies and some of the research programs that went on for this, or is that too much?
Well, you want to give a little bit more? Excuse me.
Yeah, I'll give a little bit.
Well, give a little bit more, and then why don't we cut it off in the next 5 or 10 minutes, and then make another another part, because we've got so much information here. It's hard to cram it into 1 or 2 episodes.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, I got so much material because I mean, to be honest, like I said, I got I didn't get thrown out of the academy, but I got kind of decoupled from the academy, and now, which is great. I mean, I'm blessed to be able to make my living as a musician, but being able to just go back and approach such a broad subject like this that doing my work on India prepared me for. It's just amazing that this stuff I think it very much can be tied together. So I mentioned the cantometrics and the radio project. You have Hadley Cantrell and Paul Lazarsfeld, and these are like the two guys behind kind of this Rockefeller-funded project, which had lots and lots of different sub-projects. So you can almost see this as a this is starting around 1939. And so and all these different sub-projects, again, are very much connected with how, let me just get some quotes from these guys. Study the audio control of human emotions for a large enough portion of the audience to find effective crowd control to induce mass hysteria. John Marshall is one of the people involved with this project. He says, in this job, the first step was to make explicit was to make explicit folkways implicit in our culture. Think about that. To make explicit folkways implicit. So you look at folkways records, right? That's kind of an archaic term, right? But that folkways really means social matrix, right? The you know, when you look at it, you go to a small town, you know, what's a society? How does society function? What is this cohesion or cultural glue? So why would you want to make them implicit? Collectivism is such a folkway, right? Collectivism is a folkway. And so but other folkways undoubtedly existed, which admittedly come in the varying degrees of conflict with collectivist trends. Basically, well, that's sort of end quote, but the idea is making what's explicit in the culture implicit, or else finding how to do that. Look at subculture. There are explicit messages about social organization when you take these movements to their logical conclusion, but they're made implicit. They're being encoded, right? They're discovering how the mediums of communication can be used not only to really to funnel, because a folkway sort of is a way of funneling groups, right? So in folkways recordings, interesting. Not saying that that's connected with that. If I try to get a Smithsonian grant, I hope they remember this. But they describe, you know, working on propaganda, establishing the influence of radio and television, and establishing a meta-analysis of mass subjectivity, right? The bioenergetic effects of music and mass subjectivity. And what's interesting is you have an interesting combination, again, of these communists, so to speak, or far left guys like Adorno, and then you have these other, you know, Burzmeier, who's a little bit more on the right wing. But the idea was working on the dream screen. So they were coming. It had very much a psychoanalytic basis, right? So the psychoanalytic basis was sort of Lacan. Lacan is sort of a post. You got these like post-Freudian guys, Lacan and stuff like that, and they look at the individual's mind in their, like, again, the dream screen or mirror stage that takes place when someone imbibes any kind of media, right? Especially mass media. So radio, concerts, cinema. And so working on this, so they're really working on a very deep psychological level. And in a sense, also seeing how the personality can be molded. That's what he says. Let's see how to mold this phenomena. And just one other quote: to study the effects of such a phenomena, you must retain the same group of people much longer under observation than is usually done in research experiments. So you look at these generations, right? And if you look, when I go into some of the kids' music that they're listening to, and then you listen to 60s rock, these same people, you can see possible ramifications of these studies. It goes in all kinds of detail, but basically synchronized light, sound, performance space, process effects, and basically how he described this electronic development of bioenergetic psychoacoustics. Sounds pretty fun, huh? Bioenergetic psychoacoustics. Just there's your rave right there, right?
You know, and you can see this in the Grateful Dead as well. I mean, you know, here they're developing, you know, Stanley Osley's developing, or Osley Stanley, whatever the heck, is developing this massive sound system for the Grateful Dead. He's making the LSD that they're giving out, you know, and the whole light show, the whole thing, all the embedded words. You know, I went to, I think, 8 Dead shows back in the day, and now it's like, wow, it all really starts to make sense when you see it in these terms.
Yeah, no, it really does. And that it reminds me of that FM radio. There's a great clip of a guy who was working for the radio station, and he said, when you go to this, there's a New Year's Eve show, he's like, when you go there, and what they're doing with the sound system, what they're doing with the music can have an extremely harmful effect on you and cause possible permanent damage. And this is a guy saying that who was at these shows. And he said going there was like, you had to be like, it's like running a marathon. But he directly says where the way they're manipulating the sound, the way Owsley's guys are manipulating the speaker systems, the way the Grateful Dead are manipulating the music, the what, you're getting. And he said it have a permanent harmful effect. And this is a guy, from the counterculture saying that. So,
well, oh boy, wow. Oh, anyway, I don't want to go into too much on that. It's just so in your face now, and the more we look at the Dead and everything, and so many people are going to be offended because they were just at this Dead show and the Grateful Dead, yay, but most of the Grateful Dead were known agents, admitted agents. Bob Weir hanging out with General Bill McQuinn at Bohemian Grove. General Bill McQuinn helped found the CIA. Mickey Hart, a bunch of the other guys. John Perry Barlow hung out at Langley with the CIA, etc. So there you have it. All right. So do we want to wrap up this part 2 with examples from different cultures?
Okay, sure. Well, yeah. So, like I said, when I started out with, I wanted to say that music, again, has this effect or can have this effect, right? And since Plato and Aristotle, ancient China, ancient India, even Islam, right? We look at Islam, now you see, they're evil Muslims, they're controlling music. Well, maybe there's some reasoning behind that, right? But all of these different cultures, we find different tiers of this going on. For example, if you look at the use of particular types of Native American drumming that can be used for healing. So where people will, perhaps take peyote or something, and this drum can actually be utilized for profound transformational healing processes.
Well, and when you look into it, and what I've been revealing in my work, how psychedelics promote hypersuggestion and inculcation into the culture. So you couple that with the drumming and this whole, like the Huichol going across the desert, etc., on the peyote hunt, then you have the full inculcation, and you can see it. It's just, okay, so now we understand that music is one more level of that process.
Yeah, but it's also a little bit different, right? Because it's very liquid. It's a liminal phenomenon, right? It kind of goes between spaces. You know what I mean? It's something that kind of goes into nooks and cranny of our mind and nooks and cranny in the background, a lot of times in the background of our culture, right? So it's one of those things that usually it's not credited necessarily with causing mass movements, but certainly influencing them. But it is something also that, that people just don't think about. And it also, again, it goes to that, what is human consciousness? And it's a control mechanism, but I think it's also a doorway out, I think, very much so. And, you can find examples of, music, I mentioned China, where they go around and retune all the instruments for each successive dynasty.
Emperor or dynasty, okay.
Emperor or dynasty. And so there's a lot of examples of, music being used for example, for war, right? So music is used, say, in Africa also for certain tribes and groups to get people to go to war. So it's being used to get this violence, to get this energy going. There's a lot of uses of, politically charged songs, politically charged, compositions that have been employed both in Western culture and also smaller scale societies. But there's also the main thing to note, though, I think, to take away from this is that, music has had a fundamental role in shaping culture, shaping perception, and usually it is the people at the very top that are aware of this, not your average. Most people are not going to be aware of this. This is, the shaman may know what he's doing, but no one else is going to know what he's doing, right? At the same time, music was something that was very organic outgrowth of society, and was even in America until probably, beginning in the 20th century. You start seeing this, a little bit of a disconnection of music's kind of organic role in social and cultural processes, to now it's gone, really to an extreme end. And I just would like people to keep in mind that, the world you see around you, it doesn't mean that, that you have to like lock yourself in a dark room, and or something, and just totally block out all cultural influences. But
The
it's very
key is
important.
being aware, isn't it?
The key is being aware, but also start trying to, learn about things, start trying to, use sound for healing, or else try not to use it at all. But I think it's very important that we start realizing that there is a tradition of Western civilization, which I see is about ready to totally collapse. And whatever your views are on Christianity, Christianity was the glue that held this together.
That's right.
Permitted the development of all these things we see around us was really facilitated by a large part through Christianity. And so when you see this massive assault on any kind of tradition, I think people should start to think that maybe it's time to rethink what we think about classical music, what we think about quote unquote traditional values, because maybe there's a reason that these were in place.
Right. And that's been the question. Even Joe Atwill, who's written so much, Caesar's Messiah, etc. He's been on the show 13 times, and he and I have discussed this on the show. It's like, well, how could you get rid of the mythological bad parts of Christianity, but keep the cultural values, the family morals, the work ethic, and that's really what they want to destroy, is that work ethic and the moral family values there. So I don't know, but they sure are worried about Christianity, to say the least, and it's definitely their biggest target. And when you see all the Satanism mixed in with all of this stuff, you just can't help but see the irony in it all, especially with the Christians shouting revelations, etc. So, got to hand it to them. They've been screaming about this stuff from the rooftops for decades, centuries, who knows.
Yeah. Well, and it's one of those things where, if you looked at me, I mean, I play music. I've been part of various music circles. I've been involved in everything you can think of. And I've, been tons of concerts and stuff, but it's just that if I saw myself now, I'd be like, you're like a right wing, wacko. I probably would have run for myself.
Yeah, well, I would say even from the time I started the show 7 years ago now to now, and just doing so many interviews and looking at so much research and talking to so many people, it's like, wow, well, I kind of agree with the Christians, and and I came from that and I saw what it did, and you got it, I mean, it's just. I guess growing up, you say, oh, gee, I remember I used to work for the LA Times down in Orange County many years ago. And I remember talking to this customer, and he was like all upset about the liberal rag and all of this stuff he was saying, right? And he says, when you're about 40 or 44, you'll understand, and I'm like 44 this year, and I'm thinking of all this stuff, and then I remember that guy yelling that at me, or not yelling, just telling me that, and I'm just sitting there going, yeah, well, I do. So, I mean, it's really interesting, but if you can put it into context of why you're quote-unquote getting conservative, it's because you're understanding, and not everybody does, but it's because we're understanding how this mind control worked, how they created the counterculture and the music to go with it, and the peace symbol and all of this stuff. And then we, have to step back and say, well, why are they trying to destroy the family? Why are they trying to create single moms and free love and free sex and tune in, turn on, drop out, and all of this stuff? And then when we step back, we can see, the larger agenda going on, and it's not a good one. I mean, they're trying to create the ultimate slave state. So whether or not you're a Christian is irrelevant. It appears that the Bible has been a blueprint for how they're trying to destroy society. It's like Kabbalism or Hermeticism. They take the Bible and they flip it upside down, and they use it, instead of holding families and cultures together, they're using it to, the inverse, the antithesis of it, to try to break culture, So I think we're going to need at least 2 more episodes in this series here, Hans. You agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. But yeah, just follow up here on your point. I mean, to keep going, but you look at the fact that the esoteric, the numerology, the use of this symbolic stuff, this, whether or not you believe in occult references, symbols or not, the elite use it a lot.
Right.
And the other thing is that what's it's one of those things that really it hurts almost when you see that the goals of society that society presents to you, either you can work in an office or you can become a rock star and become this debased thing. Or if you see all the litter idols, everyone is the Beats or whatever, everyone is taking drugs, is how you do it. You have to trash the past. You have to keep getting more extreme. And that's the thing, like I mentioned, G.G. Allen is an example of the total extremity. You have to pull some stuff up on that guy because he said, I'm a rock and roll. My whole body is rock and roll. My body is a temple for rock and roll. And he's like slicing himself open and, just disgusting.
Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Now we get it,
Yeah, well, we get it. And at the same time, there's so many well-meaning people that you're looking at an industrial society that doesn't really offer a lot of other directions, at least that are available. And so people turn away from like understanding the trivium quadrivium and going back to classical education. They turn away from that.
Well, and they've been pushed away from it through the compulsory education system and dumbing down. And it's like if people were really this bad and so awful that needed to be killed off, they wouldn't spend so much money into dumbing them down and debasing them and all of this. But why don't we wrap up part 2 here, Hans, and, we'll do part 3 and 4 soon.
All right, Jan. Thanks, man. It was great talking to you again.
Likewise.